Yeah. But the colors and the light.
Nobody else has it. And they-
I did, but I was on the other side of the camera.
Oh, he is very cool. It's only people out there. I have this too. No, I'm not.
I didn't think the makeup was better the second day. Everybody was less. Yeah, it was better. And then they didn't forget their mind. Thursday.
But I think that. I think about it, yeah. It's part of the. To do a comedy, we don't mind.
I was gonna say they were, and Noel was very disappointed.
The
that they
lost
should-
focus, I think that. And it was neat.
Yeah.
It wasn't bad at all, but
No.
it just wasn't.
A lot of people, like my parents didn't notice that they were missing stuff.
Yeah, nobody.
It was just.
Nobody knew
people
what
that
else.
were being it.
Yeah.
Still feel badly for all those that didn't get to do the killer scene. I wish we could have at least taped,
That would have been really cool. If we were getting rid of all the.
yeah. Which we, if they'd agreed to, well, even then we'd had to put makeup on and everything too, though, if we were recording it.
You have any extra handouts?
I,
No, that's okay.
Don't see any. Are we recording yet?
yeah.
Oh, all that silly stuff I was saying is there for posterity. All right. We are, welcome to Medieval Times. We're looking at the Crusades. If someone ever asks you, why are the Crusades important? Then hopefully you'll have an answer. So let's review a little bit. Does anybody remember the name of the Pope who gave out the first call for Crusades to the Holy Land? No. He didn't live in the country. Urban, right, Urban II. In 1095, which is just before the beginning of a millennium. So that, as you remember, played a role in the excitement as well. Does anybody remember the response of the people that were there when he gave out this call?
Overwhelming, and God willed it.
God wills it. They said, God wills it, God wills it. Good. And those that were who decided to go were called Crusaders. Does anyone remember why? Where the word crusade comes from?
It's often the word cruise, right?
The word what?
C-R-U-Z.
X. Yeah, crux. Which means
Cruise.
cross. It's where we get our word crucifixion as well. All right. So okay, see if we can do this without looking. I'm going to look just to check on you, but what are some of the motives the Crusaders had for going on a crusade?
Plundering. Plundering.
Plundering. Okay, that's one. Religious, that was the dominant one. And can anybody want to say, make any comments about the religious motive? What does that mean exactly?
Free the Holy Land from Turkey.
Okay, part of it was to free the Holy Land from the Turks, from the Muslims.
Special plenary, is that?
Yeah, plenary.
Yeah.
Yeah, plenary indulgences. In other words, our sins are covered. So part of it related to salvation as well. Okay. And the Pope had another reason that was more kind of political.
He didn't want, he wanted like to control. Right?
Okay, yeah, that's true. But there, I'm thinking of something that he hoped to bring together. Well, let me ask you this. Who was it that asked for help?
Was it Italy or was it France or Germany?
No. Wrong part of the world there. Who was it that asked for help from Pope Urban to protect them from the Muslims?
Constantinople.
Yes. And so what was Constantinople, the
was the us Turks. And then the Turks, the Muslims, weren't really Muslims or Turks, but they were.
Okay, the Turkish Muslims had invaded Asia Minor and they were knocking on the door of Constantinople. And so the Bishop of Constantinople, who was the head of what entity? Is actually called a patriarch.
Catholic Church,
Rephrase that.
Roman Catholic Church.
No, not Constantinople. That would be Rome. Hence the Roman part of that Catholic Church. Constantinople, the patriarch was the head of what?
The Eastern Orthodox.
Eastern Orthodox Church. So the Pope Urban is hoping that by responding to this, sending crusaders not only to protect Constantinople, but also free the Holy Land, that he would also bring the Eastern and Western churches together again. Heal the breach between East and West. All right, so we have plunder and religious. What are some other motives? You remember without looking?
Adventure.
Adventure, good,
Trying to gain territories.
good, especially among the kings. We're going to do that. That's 4. Think
Salvation.
salvation, you know, even by itself, and there's one more.
Like the word was really neat. White robes with the red glasses.
Yes, it was a fashion statement. No,
Always about money somewhere, right?
yeah, this was specifically related to the Italian merchants. They wanted to have some economic gains through establishing trade routes, breaking the monopoly of the Arabs as they were bringing materials to them. Okay, good. So you remembered a lot of those from memory. The First Crusade was made up of 2 parts. The way I approached it, depending on who you read, it may be different. But what was the first part of the First Crusade? Unorganized. And who would be considered the leader? Not Herman.
Peter Herman.
Peter the Hermit. Yes. Did you get my reference to Herman?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure, you know, I got blank looks, so, but I'm used to that. So Peter the Hermit, and remember what I call his sidekick, he really wasn't, but it's
Cousins.
Piggy,
Miss Piggy.
Miss Piggy. Did you say something?
The peasants.
Well, the peasants went with him, but who was another leader, really? Someone the penniless, which is kind of what a hermit is, but this was Walter the Penniless. I can see him as either sidekick, or think of it as a ventriloquist and his dummy. Peter the Hermit and his buddy Walter the Penniless. Anyway, that might help you remember. Let's see, they went through much of Western Europe, spreading death and destruction all along the way. They arrived at Constantinople and caused a lot of problems there. And so the leader of Constantinople shipped them out. And what happened to them? If they left Constantinople, went into Muslim territory, what happened? Yeah, they were slaughtered. They all were killed except for Peter the Hermit, who had gone back into town to get supplies. Yeah, sort of the opposite of the Lone Ranger and Tonto. You know, and that Tonto goes into town to get supplies and he gets beat up. But in this case, Peter went into town and to get supplies and he didn't get beat up. Okay, the next part of the First Crusade is called the organized part. And that was made up of or led by kings and knights, although 90% of the people who went on the crusade were not so. Let's see, what can I ask you about that? I'll just say they captured Nicaea, Antioch, Jerusalem. And let's see, how did they behave after capturing Jerusalem? Let's just go there. They threw a party, invited everybody to come. Yeah, barbaric. They killed everybody. Muslims, Jews, men, women, children. It was a slaughter. And this is one of the things that gives the Crusades a bad name. and gives Christianity a bad name. Because these guys are not acting like Christians, not acting in the way that we've been talking in our Sunday school class in the Gospel of Luke, showing mercy and of loving enemies. They went in and just killed. Let's see. That's enough about that, I think. There's a lot of interesting things happen there, but we don't want to redo everything. So if we look at the First Crusade, we would say that it was largely successful, as we just look at the last part of the organized part. Successful from the standpoint of capturing Jerusalem and making it safe now for pilgrims to come. Not successful in acting like Christians. You can say that. All right, any questions about the First Crusade? All right, let's go on to the Second Crusade. You see the dates there? So the first call was given in 1097. And so this is approximately 50 years later, a Second Crusade comes into being. The cause was a new Muslim offensive that threatened the Crusader states. Now, when in the First Crusade, when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem and these other areas, they set up governments there and took over the area. Well, Muslims began to encroach upon those, especially what they called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, which led to the launching of a Second Crusade. Especially egregious to the potential Crusaders was the fall of the city of Edessa in 1149, because it was a key city in the defenses of the Crusaders' kingdom. The sponsor of this crusade was our old friend Bernard of Clairvaux. Remember him? He persuaded the kings of France and Germany. Bernard's father had participated in the successful First Crusade, causing Bernard to gleefully accept the appointment of the Pope to promoting another crusade. One person writes, he traveled around Europe, calling upon rulers and ruled alike to enlist in the cause of Christ. Among other things, he put an end to the activities of one misguided monk who was urging the Crusaders to practice their military skills by massacring the Jews in Germany. Oh, let's practice on them. And Bernard said, no, don't do that. All right, so the course of it was that they made it to the other side of Constantinople. You can see on the map here. Whoops, that's not the right one. How did that get in there? Disregard that map. I don't know why that's there. They made it to the other side of Constantinople, which you can see on the map here, even though it's the wrong crusade. And there they were defeated. So this crusade ended in disaster. Bernard blamed the failure of the Second Crusade, quote, on the sinfulness of the Crusaders. Those who put the blame on him, he argued, were really attacking God himself. So don't blame Bernard or you'll be blaming God. It's your fault because you are a bunch of sinners. So the Second Crusade ended up in failure. Any questions about the Second Crusade?
Yeah, you have something about sponsored, and I missed that.
Yeah, Bernard of Clairvaux was the sponsor. He was the one that was promoting it, in other words. It wasn't like he was paying for it. Anything else? Okay, now here, the next one's a more interesting one. The Third Crusade, which is sometimes called the King's Crusade. And you see the dates there, 1189 to 1192. And this is a drawing made by Gore, I think, of Second Crusaders. Oh, this should have been on before this. This is not the Third Crusade. This is the Second Crusade encountering the remains of the First Crusaders. So how would you like to be? Yeah, let's go on a crusade. And along the way, you find the bones of those that went before you. All right, so let's get on track here with the slides, hopefully. There we go, the King's Crusade. The cause was that the Turks took Jerusalem under their new leader, Saladin. If you've ever read anything about the Crusades, you've read about Saladin. Now, he was not a Turk himself, he was a Kurd. If you follow the news the last couple decades in Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, you've heard of the Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group that lives somewhere, sometimes, or part of eastern Turkey and northern Iraq. And they've been involved in a lot of stuff going on, and both Turkey and Iraq are afraid the Kurds are going to try to form an independent nation. Well, they were around back then as well. He actually came from Egypt, and he came up and unified the formerly divided Muslims. As you read through history, you find that if there's one word that describes Muslims throughout history, it's divided. There are always groups fighting against one another. Years and years ago, Iraq and Iran were fighting against one another. And people at the time were, they're both Muslims. Why are they fighting? Because they're two different groups of Muslims, the Sunni and Shiite for those two cases. But during World War I, Lawrence of Arabia, you've heard of him probably. His job for the British was to go and try to unite the Arab tribes to fight against the Ottoman Turks. Now, they all hated the Turks, but they also hated one another. So it was a really huge job to try to do that. I highly recommend the movie Lawrence of Arabia to give you a sense of Arab culture, of the Muslim religion, especially back in the early 20th century, but it really hasn't changed that much. Saladin came to unify the tribes, and he built a strong Muslim state which enveloped the Latin kingdom on its land frontiers. In 1187, a memorable and decisive battle at Hattin, the European forces were cut to pieces. An Arab historian reported seeing severed heads, eyes dulled or gouged out, bodies covered with dust, dismembered limbs, severed arms, split bones, feet hanging by a thread from legs, bodies cut in two, torn lips, smashed foreheads. Someone else has written, Jerusalem and most of the Crusaders' centers soon fell to the triumphant Islam. So basically, there's a resurgence of Islam that has taken over all that was gained by the First Crusade. So there's a rallying of the troops, and we find three kings leading armies from three different countries taking the leadership here. First, from Germany, it's Frederick Barbarossa, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick Barbarossa was a name given to him because he had red hair. And then from France, oops, he got behind Frederick. Well, you'll see a picture of him later. From France, it's Philip Augustus. And he was a scheming kind of king, trying to work his way around different things, as we'll see. And then from England, you know him, you love him, you've heard of him. It's Richard the Lionhearted. Kind of expected to be applause, but that's okay. I can add it in if I need to. He was an adventurous king of England, whose mother you may have heard of as well, Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was a very influential, probably the most influential woman, certainly of that part of the century, if not the century in its entirety. So his mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine. His father was Henry II. Eleanor brought with her from France, where she grew up, and was actually married to Louis VII of France. So she and Louis were man and wife. She was the queen. In fact, she even accompanied him on the Second Crusade. But then he, depending on which story you read, he maybe was jealous of how much attention she was getting because she was beautiful, and maybe of the attention she was giving to some of the men around. So their But they did a lot of stuff together, but then all of a sudden on this crusade, things started to fall apart. And so they received an annulment in 1152. But she brought with her from France to England a great innovation: fireplaces. No longer do you have to spend a cold, sleepless night because you have no fire. They have fireplaces now. So you can remember her for that. She married Henry II of England just 8 weeks after her annulment from the King of France. And Eleanor, I don't know the reason behind this. Maybe, I mean, because I think she wanted to be out of France, because Henry II was one of the guys she was flirting with. But she wore the color of mourning to her wedding. Can you guess what that color was? No.
White.
It was white. And it was set a precedent for brides ever since. Even though she wasn't a virgin, but somehow that got mixed in there too. So she wore white. The movie The Lion in Winter, you've probably heard of it if you haven't seen it, depicts Eleanor and her influence on her sons. Henry II, then, her new husband, was the king, if you remember, whose brash comment led to the death of Thomas à Becket. Remember when he said, well, who will rid me of that monk? And a couple of his soldiers went and killed him. All right, so sometime I need to bring all these people together because we've covered them in separate installments. And at some point, I need to give you a timeline that shows where all these people are. But that time is not yet, because now we're in the Crusades. All right, the course of the Crusades was this. Oh, there's Richard the Lionheart. I didn't mention, maybe I will later, but the vast majority of his rule, Richard spent out of the country. So highly regarded, a hero, but he really didn't spend much time in England. Okay, the course of it is this. Barbarossa, and there's a picture of him with his red beard, accidentally drowned on the way in Asia Minor. What apparently happened is they were crossing a stream and he fell off his horse. And the problem wasn't that he couldn't swim, but that his armor prevented him from getting up. And so he drowned. So that eliminated one king. Richard was the kind of guy that managed to alienate every other ruler with whom he came in contact. One day, for example, Leopold, the Duke of Austria, made an insulting remark about Richard's father. This made Richard so angry that he took hold of the Duke and kicked him hard as if he were a poor villain or a common slave. You don't do that to dukes. And that was an insult, which was never to be forgiven. There was constant strife between Richard and Philip. Oh, I forgot to show you this. This is Eleanor of Aquitaine marrying Louis VII in 1137. Louis VII departing on the Second Crusade. I should have had that slide before Barbarossa. And there's the coronation procession of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, in 1189. There's Barbarossa's death. That's why I had it there. And there's a little information about it. And now let's go to, these are the routes that they took. So Barbarossa doesn't make it any further than Asia Minor. And Philip and Richard come together then, and there was constant strife between them. So Philip decided, I've had enough of this, and he went back to France shortly after they got to the Holy Land. Upon Richard's arrival in 1191, he found the city of Acre, or it looks like Acre, under siege. Suspecting duplicity while negotiating for the release of captives, Richard ordered the immediate massacre of 2,700 Muslim hostages. And you see that depicted on the right. One woman was helping to fill a moat at Acre during the Third Crusade. After depositing the load she had been carrying, she was shot with an arrow. While she lay dying, she asked her husband to use her own body to help fill up the moat, which was done. No man, wrote a contemporary, could ever forget such a woman. And she was one of the number of women that accompanied these men on the Crusades. During this battle at Acre, it was also reported that 3 Frankish women fought from horseback and were recognized as women only when captured and stripped of their armor. A Muslim writer, Ahmad ad-Din, claimed that among the Franks, and by Franks, they're talking about the Germans, there were indeed women who rode into battle with cuirasses and helmets dressed in men's clothes. Now, women occasionally participate in even more bloodthirsty activities. When a Turkish galley was taken, a galley, remember, is a kind of boat, at a time which I couldn't pinpoint the time, but it was somewhere in the Crusades. Christian women went on board, according to a contemporary, seized the captured Muslims by the hair, cut off their heads, and bore them back in triumph to the shore. So women can't claim that men are the only ones that are rather bloodthirsty at times. Well, alone, Richard succeeded in defeating Saladin in many battles, although not in conquering Jerusalem. Saladin, as I said, was a Muslim. He was a Kurd. He had come down from northern Iraq after being in Egypt. Originally from northern Iraq, who came to power in Egypt and restored Egypt as a major Muslim power in the Middle East. Having declared a jihad against Christians, Saladin oversaw the crucial battle of Hattin in July 1187, which was what precipitated this crusade. Thousands of Christians were killed during the battle and hundreds slaughtered afterwards. Then Saladin swept through Palestine, taking Jerusalem and capturing more than 50 Crusader castles in 2 years. Now, at this time, a woman by the name of Margaret of Beverly was in Jerusalem when it was under attack by Saladin. She says she defended the city like a man, putting a cooking pot on her head as a helmet and carrying water to the men on the walls. She was injured by fragments from a boulder big as a millstone fired by Saracen engines, by the Muslims. When Saladin was done, he had pushed the Christians back to 3 coastal cities. Now, as Richard and Saladin battled against one another, they developed a respect for one another, which was unusual between the Christians and the Muslims. Saladin highly respected Richard as a pleasant, upright, magnanimous, and excellent man. Once when Richard contracted a serious fever, Saladin sent him peaches and pears along with ice from the top of Mount Hermon, 100 miles away. Richard became such a terror to the Muslims that their mothers used to frighten their children when they were bad by saying, "King Richard will get you if you don't obey," as if Richard were an ogre or a goblin. Richard and Saladin did agree to a 3-year truce that allowed pilgrims free access to the holy places in Jerusalem prior to Richard's departure for home, having been informed of his brother John's plots to take the throne and of France's war preparations against England. And you remember what he was called then, Prince John, and the association with stories we've heard of Robin Hood and so on. Here is a picture of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin at battle. I know it's hard to see these black and white, but they are interesting to say the least. There's the Crusaders' war machinery on the left, the Battle of Antioch on the right. And sometimes they had friendly tournaments during the Third Crusade between the Muslims and the Christians. So this Third Crusade was largely successful because Jerusalem was at least, even though it wasn't captured by the Christians, it was at least open for pilgrims to come. I'm going to go on to tell what happens next with Richard, but do you have any questions about the crusade itself? The King's Crusade. 3 kings started, only 1 king went all the way because Barbarossa drowned and Philip got mad at Richard, so it was all Richard. Meanwhile, on his return to France, Philip II tried to seize Richard's lands in France. Remember, at this time, English kings own a lot of land in France. And so Philip figures, well, Richard's away, I'll grab his land, since I don't like him anyway. And then on his way home, Richard was captured by the guy that he kind of beat up, the Duke of Austria, whom Richard had assaulted. The Duke later handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held him for a ransom of 100,000 silver marks. Now, who was supposed to pay that ransom? Prince John. How interested is Prince John in paying a ransom for his brother? Now, in fact, that's some of the plot if you watch some of the movies about this time of Robin Hood and all that. It's raising a ransom for King Richard. So instead of trying to rescue his brother, Prince John was secretly glad and out of the way. He began to arrange with Philip to divide Richard's kingdom. But a boy harpist named Blondel, to whom Richard had been kind, started out to find where his master was imprisoned. Blondel went on foot through Europe, playing for people and asking what prisoners were in the different castles he passed. Can you imagine that? This boy harpist, he doesn't know where he's going. He's just searching for King Richard. After months and months of weary searching, the young minstrel sat down in despair by the wall of a great castle in Germany and began to play and sing a sad little song which no one knew but King Richard and himself. Imagine his surprise when a deep bass voice came floating down to him from a little lofty window of the massive building, singing the second verse. He hurried back to England, informing Richard's mother, Queen Eleanor, who, with some English barons, quietly raised the money required by the Emperor of Germany to obtain Richard's release. Richard died, however, just a few years later at the age of 41, as he went into a minor battle in northern France and was killed by a single arrow. And there's a picture of, or a painting of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the mother of Richard I. Any questions about Richard the Lionheart and what happened after the Crusade?
He died in England.
In France. He was in a battle in France, presumably defending his property. I don't know much about the battle. Okay, let's go to the Fourth Crusade. This is sometimes called the Diverted Crusade, from 1202 to 1204. You'll see why in a moment. Unlike earlier crusaders who maintained the pretense, at least, of a religious undertaking, the participants of the Fourth Crusade abandoned the ideals of their predecessors and openly pursued political and economic gains. Inspired by Pope Innocent III to destroy Saladin's army base in Egypt as a prerequisite to taking the Holy Land, they thought they would take care of that stronghold first. Merchants of Venice agreed to provide ships to go to England and then to Jerusalem for 84,000 silver coins. When only a third of the expected crusaders showed up with only 50,000 coins, the merchants said, nah, I don't think we're interested anymore. But the crusaders negotiated and agreed to support the Venetian attack upon a rival seaport in the Adriatic Sea at the town called Zara. So we'll help you get to the Holy Land if you first help us capture this city that's a rival of ours. Well, the conquest increased the Crusaders' not desire to reach the Holy Land, it increased their desire for plunder and booty. And so an Eastern prince offered to finance the crusade on the condition that the Crusaders sail to Constantinople and dethrone the current Eastern emperor. Pope Innocent III forbade it, but they went anyway. In 1204, they attacked and pillaged the Byzantine Christian capital that had originally requested help against the Turks. So now the Crusaders, who were initially supposed to help Constantinople to rescue Constantinople, ended up taking it over. The citizens of Constantinople eventually revolted against these crusaders, so the crusade leaders decided to plunder the city. One priest even promised the Pope's indulgence if they should die while they're plundering this Christian city. On Good Friday, 1204, the Crusaders, with red crosses on their tunics, sacked Constantinople. For 3 days, they raped and killed Christians in the name of Christ. The city's statues were melted down. The Church of Holy Wisdom, called the Hagia Sophia, was stripped of its gold vessels. A harlot danced on the altar, singing obscene songs. One Eastern writer lamented, "Muslims are merciful compared with these men who bear Christ's cross on their shoulders." Many artifacts of Constantinople can be seen today in the Basilica of San Marco in Venice. They set up a Latin kingdom there that lasted 60 years. After the Fourth Crusade, the church was forever divided into two groups, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. The intended unity of the church to be brought about by crusades instead resulted in irreparable division. The conquering of Constantinople created a weakness of the city from which she never recovered, resulting in the eventual defeat at the hands of the Muslim Ottoman Turks in 1453. There are Crusaders coming to Constantinople. Sorry, I got behind on slides. They're entering Constantinople. And there are the effects. So this crusade, because it was totally off course, was an utter failure. Any questions about the Fourth Crusade? So far, Christians are not doing very well as far as upholding any kind of morality, are they? You can see why the Crusades are pointed to by many as an example of the sinfulness, the treachery, the awfulness of Christians. But one thing I have to say, I'll say it here, I guess, I'll probably say it again. When people point out what the Crusaders did, if you research what the Muslims did, they did equally terrible things. The difference is that when Muslims or when Christians did those terrible things, they were going against their founder, Jesus Christ, and what he taught. When the Muslims did terrible things, they were following the example of their founder, Muhammad. Let's go on to the next crusade, which is called the Children's Crusade. Oops, before going there, I've got another slide here I forgot about. Not a single Muslim died as a result of the Fourth Crusade because it wasn't directed against them. Religion was no longer important. The other crusades that followed lost the. They weren't as successful, certainly, as any of the others. The ideal did not survive. Okay, there's the division of the church. I thought I was getting to earlier, didn't get to it. To see where the dividing line is. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you this too. Some wonder what's the difference between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. See, the Roman Catholic services used to be conducted in Latin. Now it's in the vernacular, whereas in Eastern Orthodox are conducted in Greek or local languages. Roman Catholic, the Pope has authority. In Eastern Orthodox, the Patriarch and other bishops head the church as a group. Roman Catholic, the Pope claims authority over all kings and emperors. Eastern Orthodox, the Emperor claims authority over the Patriarch and other bishops. Roman Catholic priests may not marry, or Eastern Orthodox priests may be married. Roman Catholic, divorce is not permitted. Eastern Orthodox, divorce is allowed under certain circumstances. Similarities, they base their faith on the gospel of Jesus and the Bible, so they say. They use sacraments such as baptism. Although the Greek Orthodox, especially Eastern Orthodox, would include Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, as it will develop later. As far as I understand, the Greek Orthodox, however, do immerse their babies because they understand Greek better than anybody else, and that the word baptize is really the word immerse. But they do it to babies nonetheless. The religious leaders are priests and bishops, both of them, and they both seek to convert people. And Eastern Orthodox religion, or Greek Orthodox, primarily in this country, is a fast-growing church. A lot of evangelical Christians are becoming Greek Orthodox, which is interesting. Leonard.
Like there's a Byzantine Catholic Church up on Winston Pole Road. Is that, what is that?
I
That's
think-
not Roman Catholic.
No, that's Eastern. I'm not sure. I don't know how that breaks down as far as the different Eastern Orthodox, but that's in that realm, I believe.
You know, I think what an interesting subnote this whole thing is that at the end of that third crusade, like for the Children's Crusade, it was the fourth crusade.
Fourth, yeah.
The Ottoman Empire really was constructed. The Ottoman Empire was a ruling force in the world until the Battle of Gallipoli,
Mhm.
which was in 1915, 1916,
Yeah.
100 years ago. So we have somehow thought of ourselves in the Crusades and all of the red as being something of antiquity. It is really something that is of the modern age. And even the Battle of Gallipoli, the submarine is what settled it. The Turkish fleet is actually what happened, and they capitulated. But that never died off. That's still the remnants of it, and what we're seeing come back at us. It just keeps reinventing itself.
And you go back even a little bit further than that, in the 1800s, Muslims invaded Europe and Austria.
Yeah.
So that there's that the threat,
16.
the threat has been there since, well, the 7th century when the Muslims first started and they spread. And as we talked before, they were in Spain and invaded France from that direction. They've invaded from the east as well.
Just 20 years ago. Okay, I mean, we got a reprieve because of the battle, but 20 years ago, we were reading in the newspaper of this invasion of Europe by the Muslims and the people of Africa and the Mideast. So it's not over.
Yeah.
We're living in it, whether we want to admit it.
Yeah,
or not.
and the invasion you're talking about is by immigration, not by sword
The new war.
yet.
Yeah.
But we'll take a little side trip here for a moment. There's a certain, those who study population growth are able to determine at what point a low population growth will never be recovered. In other words, you get to a certain percentage of population growth, you can never increase that to have more people again. I didn't say that very well, but hope you understand what I'm saying. Europe reached that point decades ago. They are not repopulating at a rate at which they can continue to survive as a people and a culture. Meanwhile, the Muslim immigrants are having multiple children, and they are soon to take over Europe.
Finland right now is voting today. And for their prime minister and all that stuff.
Mhm.
And that is one of the main issues for the whole country. I was reading an article on the BBC. They don't have enough people in their country to maintain their economic status. So
Yeah.
they're trying to figure out how do they open up immigration? What do they do? How do they do it? Because they literally don't have enough people and jobs and money to maintain their welfare state and do all this. They have to decide if they're gonna cut it, are they gonna do whatever? And one of the big parties projected to win is what we have to do is bring in immigrants to make this work.
And unless they get them from Central America, the most likely place are Muslims.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that what we hear in this country even? One of our political leaders has said, we need to allow illegal immigrants into our country because we need people to pay for all our social programs. We need the taxes. Well, getting,
And on
yeah.
that point that you said about the popularity. It made me remember that. He's actually known as the Bible Answer Man.
Hank Hanegraaff.
Hank Hanegraaff.
Yeah.
2017. Formerly evangelical Protestant, he joined the Eastern Orthodox Church.
One of the first evangelicals I heard that made the move was decades ago, Frankie Schaefer, son of Francis Schaefer. And, you know, I've known people that have made the move as well. All right, let's go to the Children's Crusade. This is very interesting and, as you'll find, very tragic. In 1212, in the summer of that year, up to 50,000 children gathered in towns throughout France and much of Germany, convinced that God wanted to use them to free the Holy Land from the Muslims, taking as their text Psalm 8:2. From the lips of children and infants, you have ordained praise because of your enemies to silence the foe and the avenger. Now, it's hard to imagine 50,000 children before any kind of social media. How in the world did the word get out like that? You know, they couldn't read. So it's just by children traveling around, encouraging others, as we'll see. As they went forth, they sang songs of praise to God, following a young shepherd boy of about 12 years named Stephen. He was from Cloyes, France, who had experienced a vision wherein Christ told him to lead a crusade of children to the Holy Land. By August, thousands of children had gathered just north of Paris. Stephen told them that God had promised that the Mediterranean Sea would open for them so they could walk through on dry land, just as the children of Israel had walked through the Red Sea. Of course, they had no perception of how big the Mediterranean Sea was. Even if it did open up, you still got a long walk to get to the Holy Land. But they saw the Mediterranean as being their main obstacle. At the same time, another boy in Germany by the name of Nicholas also felt led to lead a crusade, attracting a large following in the city of Cologne. Out of thousands, only a third of Nicholas's followers even reached the Mediterranean coast. And when the sea did not open as promised, they settled in Italy, disillusioned and too weary to travel home. Meanwhile, Stephen's group reached Marseille, a crusader port in southern France. Also discovering that the sea did not open for them, most of them returned home, but about 5,000 remained, hoping for a miracle. Then two merchants offered them free passage to the Holy Land. Thinking that this was a provision of the Lord, they accepted. Of the 7 ships, 2 wrecked, and the other 5, instead of sailing to the Holy Land, sailed to the North African coast, where the merchants sold the children into slavery. 18 years later, a priest with the group of children was allowed to return to France by his master, who was the governor of Egypt. He reported that about 700 of them were still living. A small company was taken to the slave markets of Baghdad, and there 18 of them were martyred for refusing to accept Islam. Sad, sad ending to these children who thought they were going to rescue the Holy Land. Any questions or comments on the Children's Crusade?
I always heard that they got lost at sea instead of any of them making it at all.
Like I
That's
said,
interesting.
nefarious merchants decided to make a profit.
Parents just let them go.
Yeah.
That's when
the problem of trying to understand this, our social.
Yeah.
Their social society looked nothing like ours. By the time you were a teenager, you were an adult.
Yeah, but these are, I mean, the kid who's leading is only 12.
There's only 12.
So these are children. And who knows, part of it may be, mom and dad, God has given a vision to this guy, and I want to follow him. I want to follow God.
Mom and dad may have been dead for years for this 12-year-old. I think they're on his own for how
Yeah.
long?
But all the children have followed. Who knows the dynamics of what went into it? And I think it is such an incredible thing that some people deny that it ever happened. But I think there's plenty of proof that it did.
The thing that I can remember is when we were in Guatemala. And we're standing up in the roofs, Marcia and I, and we see all of these kids in the morning light coming out of the garbage dump.
Mhm.
And here they were going to town to forage because that was their social service system, was to allow them to live in the garbage dump. And the mayor approached Marcia because he really wanted to talk to her because he knew she was in child welfare. And it happened to be a point of interest of this.
Hmm.
So the
Yeah.
world, we don't even have a good grip on it anymore.
Yeah, same thing in Guatemala, being at the orphanage there. I've read reports of them taking in children who basically were parenting other children. 12-year-old girl caring for her younger brothers and sisters, and finally somebody took them to this place. And a lot of the kids that are in this so-called, I don't think they call it an orphanage anymore either, because a lot of the kids aren't orphans. They just, their parents just say, we can't take care of you, you're on your own. That's so sad. But who knows the dynamics of all these children? And how many of them, what happened to them in Italy? Those that stayed in Italy. It'd be interesting to do DNA on Italians. I've seen if you can find any of this German blood. Of course, there'd be other reasons for German blood being there too. Who knows? Right.
And the religious, you let your child do this, you get so much religious
Yeah.
benefit by doing that.
Yeah, might benefit you too.
Right.
I mean, I even growing up, I know a family of a young man who was, I think, 2 years younger than I, and they're Roman Catholic, and I know his mother's goal was for George to become a priest because she felt that would gain her some brownie points with God, and was upset when he decided to become a doctor. All right, next is the Fifth Crusade. We have a few more, but there's not much to say about them, so I think we can get them all in. The Fifth Crusade from 1218 to 1221 was called once again by Pope Innocent III. Once again, he thought it was important to go to Egypt, and so the Crusaders directed their efforts against Egypt, which was a source of strength and supply for the Muslims in the Near East. So basically, Egypt was supplying the other Muslims. Aided by sea power, the Crusaders captured the major Egyptian port of Damietta. You see there right on the coast in the Nile Delta. And then they tried to march inland across the Delta to Cairo. On this map, it says Kahira. That's where Cairo is. Cairo is where the pyramids are. And if you were with us way back in ancient times, you saw pictures of the pyramids there in Cairo. During this encounter, women accompanying the troop brought water, wine, and bread, as well as stones to use as projectiles. The Muslims and the flooding waters of the Nile, however, trapped their army. By returning Damietta to the Muslims, the Crusaders were given a safe passage from Egypt and accomplished nothing. So, a failure. Questions or comments about the Fifth Crusade? Next is the Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229. Have you noticed that most of these crusades are only a couple of years in length? This was led by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, whose gregarious personality and understanding of the Muslim people enabled him to successfully negotiate a 10-year truce.
What was his name?
Frederick II. He was a Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. This crusade achieved the reception of Jerusalem and a corridor of safety for Christians traveling from the coast to the Holy City. Because there had been a problem at times when Jerusalem was open, but getting there was not so open. And so from Frederick II was an agreement to allow pilgrims to travel to Jerusalem and also Bethlehem and Nazareth without having to fight any battles. Frederick II was not successful in taking Jerusalem, but in a sense, he was successful in gaining a way for pilgrims to get there, even though it was a failure in actually capturing the city. Any questions about the Sixth Crusade? Okay, good. Let's go to the Seventh Crusade. In 1244, the Muslims retook Jerusalem, prompting Louis IX of France to lead a crusade to the Near East. Outrageously expensive, he spent more than 6 times his annual income to finance this one crusade. Poorly managed from the outset, the Crusaders landed at Damietta, remember, in Egypt, and marched toward Cairo, but the Muslims routed their army and took Louis captive. After receiving a large ransom, the Muslims released him. This was a dismal failure. Quite some time later, whoops, there's the failure. Oh, there he is, a prisoner, Louis IX, prisoner in Egypt. Quite a few years later, in 1270, Louis IX said, you know, it's time to go back. Let's get the old band back together. And so he mounted another crusade, but he died shortly after reaching Muslim territory. And with that, the crusade collapsed, so that was a failure. Now let's look at the consequences of the Crusades. What do you think? Anything good come out of the Crusades? Most of the things we've said about them have been rather negative. Would you be surprised to find that there were some good things that came out of this?
Trade routes?
What?
Trade routes?
That's one of them. Yeah. Did you figure out the blanks? All right. Oops, there's a picture that I don't know what happened. 1291. I wasn't able to find what happened there, but apparently there was some fighting at the city of Agar again. Let's go on to the consequences. First of all, it opened trade routes to Central Asia and China. Now, can you think ahead to what later developments are going to occur as a result of the trade routes to Central Asia and China? Who is going to be spurred by that to sail out in the Atlantic Ocean? Columbus, yeah, and all of the explorers. What are they doing? They're trying to find another way to get to China. This is sort of the beginning of it. The second consequence is that it stimulated a return to a money economy. I think we talked about this earlier, that especially under feudalism, people were, the manors were self-sufficient. Remember that they produced everything they needed right there. Towns disappeared essentially because people couldn't buy anything. They didn't have any money. There was no money. People bartered for everything. All right, now though, if you're going to be importing goods from someplace else, you can't go down to the port or the local market and say, I want to trade half a cow for that bundle of silk. Yeah, that's just not practical. And so money began to be used once again. And when you switch to a money economy, you automatically, I shouldn't say automatically, because I suppose there are exceptions, but you at least lay a groundwork for prosperity, for increase in people's economic positions. Thirdly, and this is a part of this whole thing, is it weakened feudalism, partly because nobles and serfs died. So a lot of nobles left their lands, went off to crusade, and they died. Now, sometimes they had relatives take over, but sometimes that created confusion and chaos. And then the number of serfs that left died. So now, people are scrambling. Where am I going to find farmers and all this stuff? It's this unsettled situation. And then the serfs that came back from the Crusades said, man, I've seen a little bit of the world here. I'm not going back on that farm and staying there the rest of my life. There's too much else out there. And so even when they came back, they refused to return to the manner of living. This also increased the power of kings. Kings gained power simply by leading crusades, by the consolidation of land in the absence of nobles that died. So kings began to gain more power, stimulating nationalism. And this also led, because kings need money, it led to the introduction of the income tax. Now that there's money, people are making money, now we're going to tax that money. And of course, it also stimulated trade. As trade routes were established, more and more goods are coming from Asia, especially things like silk and spices that they didn't have in Europe. So those things were introduced. That stimulated more trade, and it just kept increasing. And then when you have people trading, what do? Well, you set up, in the West, we called it a trading post. Well, when you get a trading post, then what happens? Somebody else comes in and decides to sell another item, and pretty soon people are living there because they're involved in the economics of selling things and buying things and taking them somewhere else. And so it becomes a town. So towns begin to grow as trading centers. Then, as people are making money, selling things, you have the beginning of a wealthy middle class called burghers. Not the kind you eat. Look at the spelling. And you'll recognize it at the end of some of our cities in America. And certainly of a lot of cities in Germany.
What was number 6?
Growth of towns as trading centers.
Thank you.
Number 8, it brought classical culture of Greeks to Europe, especially Aristotle and the inductive method of study, as opposed to the deductive method of Plato. All right, you have 2 words to fill in there? Is that right? All right. As soon as you get that filled in, we'll discuss it. All right, first of all, how did the Crusades end up bringing Greek culture to Europe? Up until this time, what group of people was keeping Greek culture alive, making copies of the Greek works? Yeah, the Arabs, particularly Muslims. Yeah, they're the ones that had universities, and they were making copies of all these Greek authors. And so, as Crusaders came into those territories, they became exposed to those things and brought back with them items from the Greek world, especially the writings of Aristotle. And Aristotle promoted what's called the inductive method of study as opposed to deductive method of Plato, even though Aristotle was the student of Plato, remember? Before we get into the kinds of study, let's see if we can remember the difference between Plato and Aristotle in their philosophy of what is real. Do you remember the painting that I showed you if you were here? The philosophers? Who was it that pointed up? And who was it that had their hands like this? Between Plato and Aristotle, do you remember?
It was this way.
No. Yeah, 50-50 chance. No, Plato was like this. Why? Why was Plato pointing up? Because he believed what?
The reality was more-
Reality is in the unseen world. What is real is the spiritual, not the physical. The physical is only a shadow of the true reality in the spiritual world. Now, what did Aristotle believe? The exact opposite. So that's why his hands are like this, because this natural world is the true reality. Now, they also differed on how to arrive at truth. Aristotle believed in the inductive method of study. Plato believed in the deductive method. Now, both are valid in some ways. But what's the difference? Anybody know the difference between inductive and deductive?
Inductive is self, deductive is reason. Yes.
You could say the deductive is reason too. It's the starting point. What's the starting point in inductive or deductive? They have opposite starting points.
Inductive is objective. Am I right?
They both could be objective. It depends. Deductive might be less so. The difference is this: deductive starts with something that is believed, and then you go backwards into the different things that substantiate that belief. So you get the detailed analysis that substantiate what you believe. Now, if what you believe is correct, then that can be very useful. You're finding what it is that leads you to that belief, or substantiates that belief, proves that belief. But Aristotle promoted the inductive method, which is that you find the facts and build the facts up to come to a belief. And so we talk about inductive Bible study. What does that mean? Inductive Bible study.
Take the Bible to study other parts of the Bible.
You
Build on what you know in the Bible.
Yeah. So inductive is observing the individual things, the different things you see there, people, places, things. You ask the W questions: who, what, where, why, when, and wherefore or how. You ask those questions so you get the individual facts. And as you build up those individual facts, then you come to some conclusions and you come to some principles. Now, the deductive method was what the Roman Catholic Church adopted, even though they adopted a lot of Aristotelianism. They also adopted some Platoism, but they followed a deductive method. Okay, here's what the church believes. Now find out what are the reasons that fit into that. Well, sometimes what the church believed wasn't correct. And so if you went against that and showed logically, inductively, they would say, oh, you can't do it that way. You got to start with the belief first. And so that's what's important about what is brought back to Europe. Now, what's going to happen is that the inductive method of study, as time goes on, and as people in the universities and in the monasteries are studying classical Greek literature, and they find this inductive approach, they begin to apply it to the Bible. And as they apply it to the Bible, inductively, they find that they don't come to the same conclusions that the church says or what we believe, which is eventually going to bring about what? Well, before it split, kind of a split, but the Reformation. Yeah. All right. So again, from the Crusades. Any questions about number 8? Okay, number 9, it brought power to the church, brought land and wealth to the church. As Crusaders conquered different areas, sometimes that land was then deeded to the church, certainly brought wealth into the church as even crusaders, if they pillaged someplace, they would give some of it to the church, get some forgiveness of sins out of it at least. And although I kind of put down the idea of the Dark Ages, because if there were really Dark Ages, it would have been the very early Middle Ages, because I think we came out of that pretty quickly. But some would say this ended the Dark Ages. And I would agree with a qualification, and that is that it wasn't as dark as many people put it, think that it was. But it did bring about a loss of the, I can't think of the word I want to use. Of just staying internally in Europe, of everything being in a box. There's now spreading out into other parts of the world and learning things from those different parts and looking at literature, looking at the, even from China, things that come that increased knowledge. A lot of things that the Chinese invented that eventually come into Europe, like gunpowder. And this one I found recently, so that's why it's a different font. It brought about advances in the field of nursing. At the time, surgery was extremely limited, but the Salerno School of Medicine taught that you should keep patients warm, clean, and quiet. Who would have thought? This method was adapted by a Crusader military order, the Hospitallers of St. John. And because of their influence, it spread throughout Western Europe. So taking care of people also was a good result of the Crusades.
Ties right back into 1915 and Florence Nightingale.
Yeah.
The Red Cross.
Yep. Here's a map of the different trade routes that developed, and different colors for the different people that were in charge of them, like Genoa is in yellow, Venetian is in red. The Hanseatic, I'm not sure if we'll talk about them at some point or not, but that's a little bit later, where there's a Hanseatic League between different merchants in Northern Europe. Here's a map that shows the trade routes, and you can see that although they're not all running east and west, even those that are running north and south are connecting to east and west. So they're primarily trying to get products from Asia and then distributing it throughout Europe. I mean, they're not to say there weren't products in Europe that were going back and forth too, but it was contact with Asia that really brought about a trade revolution. All right, any questions about the Crusades?
I
Yeah,
never
Lauren?
got that from, I took a correspondence course in Fort Wayne Bible College,
Uh-huh.
way back in the 80s. And they had me use a book from Schaff's History of the Christian Church.
Uh-huh.
3,000 pages I went through. And when they got to the Children's Crusade, that's what it said, we lost that scene.
Oh, I think, well, I'm trying to remember when Schaff lived, but it's been at least a century or more ago. Maybe more than that even. And I think there's been further research since then. Well, like this, the quote I read you from a priest. I think that was a relatively recent discovery. So that's the thing about history. There's always, even though the past doesn't change, what we know about the past changes because we keep finding more things, which makes the study of history so fascinating.
Number 9, talking about brought power to the church.
Mhm.
Is that referring to?
The Roman Catholic Church. Yeah,
Okay, that's
it's the only church there is, except for the poor Eastern Orthodox, which is getting beaten down. But in Europe, the Roman Catholic Church is the only church. Okay, anything else?
So what are we gonna get into next? Are we still gonna do this?
Yes, we only have like 2 weeks left,
That's a good question.
because there's 3 weeks off for Easter and that guy coming to speak. And
Right, so next week is off. Next week, the following week is off. Then the 30th is off, so the only one left this month is the 23rd,
And then I think there's one in May.
and then one in May, and then the second Sunday in May is off, because I think it's Mother's Day, right?
Mhm.
Went the wrong way. Yeah, and then the 21st is celebration week.
Yeah, so we have two sessions left, I believe. So, we're not going to start something new for 2 weeks. We'll do something, maybe somewhat entertaining. I haven't decided for sure yet. Because we're at the end of this section of the notes. Next fall, if you're agreeable, we'll continue and finish up the Middle Ages and then move into which I think is a very exciting period, the Renaissance and the Reformation then. I think that'll be a lot of fun. Okay. All right, great. Thank you for coming. And try to rally some students for next fall.
Thank you.
For those of you that missed ancient times, that's where we're starting in what'll be the new Youngstown Christian TV. I'm gonna have a program on there going through the times and starting out with ancient times. So whenever that gets up and running, if you missed it before, you will be able to see it on there.
What station is that gonna be on?
It's gonna be on the internet.
ICTV.org, yeah. Yeah, it's gonna be pretty neat. It's gonna have different local preachers on there and different programs. It's really cool.
So is your